Harkin and I drove the red bus to the entrance of the city where Valentine had said a group of people called the Scraggs lived. When we arrived, Harkin's face showed signs of distress. He spoke only one word to me that morning. It was home. We had come back to the place where it all begun, where the beginning of the end had taken place. Somewhere here was the one building which had ignited the end of the world. We both left the bus and walked out into the devastation. As far as the eye could see, there was just barren wasteland. Life as man had known it had gone. The city had been turned into a massive graveyard, and all about it were scattered those who had once lived. I sat on a mound of ground as Harkin went about the bodies. I could no longer take the view, as the sun behind shone bright. How like any other day it looked, but this was a day of nightmares, a day which no man could ever imagine taking place. And yet, in the back of all of our minds, we knew one day this would be the end of mankind. Harkin walked through the field of bodies, and occasionally he would turn to me with a wide grin on his face. The situation, the enormous burden on his shoulders of being the man who had ended mankind's dream, weighed heavily. He, I, was convinced, was becoming mad, and there seemed little hope of his return. But I noted each time he would turn his face to me, his grin slowly receding back into his mouth, and his lips were tight and closed, almost in remorse. Whether it was the body which induced this in him, or my reaction as he grinned aimlessly at me, I am not sure. Maybe it was just instinctual. Everywhere I looked, there were bodies about this land. I could see no movement amongst this sea of corpses. They just lay end to end. Some were distinct, almost human-like. Others were a mush of human remains that looked more like soup than a skeletal structure. I could not imagine how they all came to this area, but it had now become a waste ground, their faces lined with terror and fear, captured in the last moments when the living became the dead. Above, the sun was bright as it had ever been. It knew not what had occurred on the earth below, for it continued to shine down on mankind, despite it being mankind's darkest days. Maybe the sun would shine no more for man as it had once before. I looked down at the bodies and was struck by the lack of colour amongst them. They seemed almost to blend in with the auburn dirt that was now their bed. I wonder if, like the dinosaurs over millennia, their bodies would become like a line of chalk and would show the time of the great disaster that had befallen man. Would man's long legacy end this day? Would no more sound be heard from the majestic vocals that had once rung out amongst this land? And yet, as sad as one found oneself of man's last great day, one knew that it was not an act that had befallen man, for man had made the choice of its destruction by allowing this act to happen. It was no tragedy, no accident. It was a design of man to create such wonders that would one day ultimately destroy their creators in our bid to become what we are not. Harkin was far out in the distance, but still he had not reached the end of the line of the bodies that outstretched the eye, and like a desert seemed to go on for miles. But now, like a montage, it didn't seem to matter. How many or how few, the eye like the heart became desensitized to the amount of death that surrounded us now. I walked out to Harkin down a path that he'd made with his feet through the mush that at once was man, till I found myself in the epicenter of ground zero. As I turned my head a full 360 degrees to take in my fellow brethren one last time as they lay to rest and sunk in the murky depths below them, I placed my hand upon Harkin, the only friend I had left in the world. He turned around to look at me, and I noticed in his eyes that of tears. I held on to him as I looked out onto the carnage. We both stood by the ring of corpses, as the wind softly blew the stench of human remains. Harkin told me of the time when he left the building, where this had all started, how he ran as quick as he could whilst his mind showed him the pictures of his colleagues melting behind the glass. Slowly the glass too would melt. He jumped into an army truck and sped off. As he did so, he recollected that he saw a bright blue-white flash about the sky. So bright, it was as if the whole sky was lit up. He described the amazing color that remained on his retina seconds after the explosion. Then he said a dark, foreboding fog engulfed him as a massive gust of wind thrusted the landscape, which threw his truck spinning with him inside till it landed on its wheels. Then all of a sudden the wind ceased, almost as abruptly as it had begun. He recounted that he was left in a silence in which he thought that the whole planet would crack open any second. He climbed out of his truck and looked at the people standing around him. He saw their faces of fear. In those moments of silence, slowly a dark, foreboding fog whispered in, and people began to scream and run. I ran and hid inside a place of worship and begged forgiveness for my awful sins. I never cried so much as I did that night. I felt as if I cried for all mankind, and yet maybe I had the least right to do so, he said. As he explained the events to me, I felt another white flash across my eyes, as I had many times since my awakening, and then I saw myself walking down a street, ordinarily just going about my days as if I had a whole lifetime to spend, and then I was hurtled off my feet as a strong wind rattled everything that it went by. A car alarm sounding was the last noise I heard as I blacked out. I remember, I said. I remembered where I was when it happened, how I'd come to awake to this. Harkin replied, Son, you're lucky. I'll pay anything to be able to just have one moment without the knowledge of this. But I also knew now that these white flashes were that of the disease. How long I had left I did not know. How long any of us had left was also unknown. We continued to walk further on. As we did so, I saw in the distance buildings, and in the buildings I saw lights. This must be where the Scraggs had begun to start civilization. And so Harkin and I continued to walk on the outstretched bodies towards the only hope we had left.